Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to our January 11th, 2021 Kiwanis Club meeting. As always, we're going to begin with our Pledge of Allegiance. So if everyone can unmute their mic, and then I will stand up and move out of the way so you can see my wonderful flag background, and we will say our Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. Okay. So, let me see if I can undo my virtual background here so I can be a little less distracting. Okay, there we go. I'm also trying to admit people in the waiting room here. This is quite the juggling. Okay, so I want to just follow up with a charitable trust update. Hopefully you got my email on Friday with all this information, but in case you did not, I want to go ahead and provide that. As I shared with you in our Friday email, we had a very successful charitable fundraising campaign in 2020. Donations to the general charitable trust as well as the scholarship fund totaled $15,062. I want to thank everyone who gave so generously to these trusts, and specifically thank the chairs of the committee, Angela Chang and Omika. Angela, I see you're here. I'm not sure if Omika is, but thanks to you all. And also to the committee members, Dalton Brannon, Gil Kleeman, Chip Madsen, and Lori Ott. They did an excellent job of raising that money, and now they get to decide where that money goes. I also want to provide an update on the Sam Tyson Scholarship Fund. As you may remember, the board unanimously agreed to start fundraising to endow a scholarship in Sam's name. And so far we've raised $14,950 for that. For the scholarship to be fully endowed, we will need $25,000. So we're off to a great start, but could still use some donations for that. I want to thank Tenant Houston for heading up that effort. And I really want to give a big shout out to Lowell Dorn, our Secretary Treasurer, who has done a great job in coordinating the collection of all these funds. It's been kind of difficult because we don't meet in person, and we've been taking funds via the mail, via PayPal, and then also people have been mailing directly to the CSR Foundation. So Lowell's had to sort of keep all of those balls in the air, and I'm really impressed with the efforts that he has there. Okay, so thanks to everyone, great work. We've raised over $30,000. So that's really impressive, particularly when we're not meeting in person and, you know, in this particular year. So now I want to go on to the history lesson. In choosing the lesson for today, there were several appealing choices. For example, did you know today is Alexander Hamilton's birthday? I did not. And in fact, no one's absolutely clear as to the year of his birth. Some say it was 1755, some say 1757. He was an orphan, so maybe that played into not knowing the year. On January 11th, 1785, the United States Congress relocated from Trenton, New Jersey to New York City, its temporary new capital. On January 11th, 1861, Alabama seceded from the Union. And on January 11th, 1908, Teddy Roosevelt declared the Grand Canyon a national monument. But instead, I decided to go with a history moment much closer to home. Well, I had never heard this story. I'm sure it's familiar to some of our history buffs in the club and native Augustans. Marshal Robert Forsyth, believed to be one of the first U.S. Marshals killed in the line of duty, was shot and killed while he attempted to serve civilian papers on a man. The suspect and his brother were holed up in an upstairs bedroom. As Marshal Forsyth attempted to gain access to the room, the man told him to not come any closer. At the same time, the suspect fired a shot through an opening in the door, fatally wounding Marshal Forsyth. After being arrested, the man twice escaped from jail, fled the state, and was never recaptured. One of the brothers died in Kentucky in 1817, the second in Georgia in 1826. Marshall Forsyth served in the American Revolutionary War, had been with the agency for more than 4 years before being named one of the first 13 marshals by George Washington. He was survived by his wife and 2 sons, the younger of whom became Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs in the governments of 2 presidents, and whose work included the purchase of Florida from the Spanish. The respected lawman was shot and killed on January 11th, 1794, and buried in St. Paul's Episcopal Church Cemetery in Augusta, Georgia. In fact, there is a historical marker on this first marshal killed in the line of duty outside the cemetery of St. Paul's in Augusta. I look forward to being able to read that marker in person when we can safely resume our meetings at St. Paul's. Okay, now we are going to move on to our attendance prize. Again, this is going to be a gift certificate to Toast Wine and Beverage. So it's a $15 gift certificate, so you can go get your own bottle of wine or 6 packs of beer to survive what is turning out to be a pretty interesting 2021. So I want to thank Mark Alberton for agreeing to help coordinate that for our meeting. Mark will mail the gift card to the winner. So Dr. Hatcher, I need you to pick me a number between 1 and 30.
16.
Okay. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. Sorry, y'all. It's climatic. Jeff Aslan, former past president Jeff Aslan, you have now won a $15 gift card to Toast.
How about that? Thank you so much.
Beverage. Exciting.
Great pick, Dr. Hatcher.
Martha, I just
Yes.
wanted to say, I think doing the attendance prize is a great way to get everybody to come back on to do the, since we can't meet in person, this is a good way to get people to join in.
Yes, thank you. And thanks to Mark for agreeing to help coordinate that. And Dr. Hatcher, great pick. Okay, at this point, I am going to go ahead and turn the meeting over to our president-elect to introduce our speaker, who, before he begins speaking, I do want everyone to realize that he is, in fact, my boss. He will try to deny that, but he does, in fact, evaluate me on an annual basis. So let's all be super nice to him. And I'm going to go ahead and let Troy introduce.
Dr. William Hatcher proudly hails from Millersville, Georgia. He's a professor of public administration and interim chair of the Department of Social Sciences at Augusta University. He also serves as the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Public Affairs Education publication. He received both a BS in political science and an MPA from Georgia College and State University, and a PhD in public policy and administration from Mississippi State University. His research focuses primarily on health policy and administration, community development, and public budgeting. And Dr. Hatcher is going to talk with us today about the elections of 2020, 2021, and we're happy to have him with us here today.
Thanks, Troy. And I'm going to share my screen and do what everybody says on these kind of meetings. Can you see it now? 1 second. Can everybody see it? We're good? And I am not, no matter what she says, I am not Martha's boss. I have about 30 great faculty and staff members that I work for them, and then about 300 students that I work for too. Some more than others, I think. But I really am thankful for you all inviting me to talk about the presidential election and what's going on in our nation now. I must say a few warnings before we get started. As Troy mentioned, elections and campaigns is not my main area of expertise, but growing up in Georgia and knowing about politics in Georgia, I have had some training and education on how politics and campaigns work and how they worked in Georgia. And so I really focused when I was asked to do this, really started to focus the presentation on Georgia and what happened in the presidential election in Georgia. And I'm sorry if you hear it in the background. They have decided to do our landscaping right now. So of all times, like we can usually never get them to do it, but now they're doing it. So, but okay. So a little history before we talk about the presidential election in Georgia. And also I'm going to talk some about, we don't have a lot of data yet on the presidential election and the special election for the 2 Senate seats, but I'm going to talk about those too. But a little history before we do that. I'm glad we started off, you all start the meeting off with a little history because context always matters. And when we get into talking about this year's presidential election, context really matters. And it's a transition for decades and decades, and really a long time going back how Georgia politics has changed. Georgia historically has been a state since the Civil War with one-party control. After the Civil War, during Reconstruction, Republicans had some success in Georgia. As you see down at the bottom of my slide here, Rufus Bullock, which is a great Southern 1800s name, was the last Republican governor elected in Georgia until 2002 when Sonny Perdue was elected. Georgia was solid Democrat control from the Reconstruction era up until really the 1980s when you started to have some competitive elections in Georgia statewide and for federal offices and for the presidential at the presidential level. And so much so in Georgia that the one-party control was that Georgia has 2 things that came out of that over its political history, is a tendency, like a number of other southern states, to elect demagogues. The picture here we have is Eugene Talmadge, who was elected a number of times to be governor of Georgia in the 1930s. And then his son Herman Talmadge, went on to be governor and senator from Georgia. So there's a transition, though, since the 1960s and 1970s, and really coming to a head with Sonny Perdue being elected governor, the transition from Democrats to Republicans. But it's important to note, too, in the discussion that Sonny Perdue started his political career off and was an elected representative in the Georgia General Assembly as a Democrat. So was Nathan Dill, our next Republican governor after Sonny Perdue. So you see over this transition from really conservative Democrats, Southern Democrats, ones in Georgia and other Southern states, up into the 60s and 70s were the most conservative members of the US Congress, to more moderate Democrats like Jimmy Carter, here we have in the picture, and then in the 70s and 80s. And then starting in the late 90s and early 2000s, you had a transition to this state to the state being largely solid Republican. So you have a transition from the state being for over 100 years solid Democrat to a small period of time in the 70s and 80s and 90s where it was somewhat competitive. Democrats still won most elections but it became more competitive at the presidential level during that time, to a period where it moved to solid Republican for a couple years in the 2000s, starting with Sonny Perdue in 2002, to a period that we're seeing now, and this presidential election really ushered it in, to where we're again what you call purple state, where we're a state that's, political scientists tend not to like the red state, purple state, blue state, but it's easy to shorthand, where the purple states, where you have more of a situation where it's competitive. But some of the things we're seeing that's different is the 2 senators that were elected were not your traditional moderate Democrat senators that used to be successful in Georgia to statewide offices in the 70s and 80s when you had that transition I've been talking about. They're pretty progressive Democrats. So you see Georgia becoming really divided and a lot more competitive with this election. So just a little history, some more history, but more recent history. There's really not a lot of data yet because the election just happened, and a lot of discussion out in the literature about what happened. But a lot of but one main explanation that is out there of pushing this transition to make the state more competitive again is what we're seeing that's going on in the suburbs around Atlanta, where the suburbs around Atlanta are moving from being strongholds for the Republican Party to being more competitive. And in a way, counties like Cobb and Gwinnett are becoming strongholds for the Democratic Party. So see, you have here 2004 presidential election, Kerry versus Bush. I pointed out here with my wonderful map making skills, Cobb and of course red's Bush and blues counties that Kerry won. And just aside, as you can see here in this graph, we have way too many counties in Georgia. We have 159, more than any other state except for Texas. So it makes it a little hard to talk about general geographic trends within Georgia because we have so many counties. But Cobb and Gwinnett in this, as you can see, solid Republican counties. We move forward to the 2018 gubernatorial election between Kemp and Abrams, and you can see they've moved to the blue. In a second, I'll show you the transition. Those counties are really high vote areas of the state. So you have that transition from the suburbs of Atlanta moving toward the Democratic Party. A lot of that transition has been fueled by the suburbs, highly educated parts of the suburbs being against Trump. And you have a move where a lot of the changes we'll talk about in Georgia becoming more competitive and have been fueled by demographic changes in Georgia, where the state is more diverse and is looking more like the typical state that votes for the Democratic Party. But also those changes have been accelerated from 2016 to 2020 with the suburbs backlash against President Trump that we saw in the election. So you see right here, this is going from the gubernatorial election in 2018. You see those suburbs. Just to get a little more detail, this graph here of the state is based on voting precincts. And you can see that large concentration of blue in the Atlanta area. But you also see the blue growing out on the suburbs where, going back to 2004, you had a solid Republican red votes. This shows you that change over time. It's from the New York Times. I can't take credit for these graphics. Like I said, the data's not out there yet, so I didn't cook them up myself or prepare them myself. But you see here this strong transition that I'm talking about around the suburbs of Atlanta. And these counties are the counties of the Atlanta metropolitan area from '84, when Reagan won every state except for one in the presidential election that year. You see Cobb and Gwinnett, but all the suburbs of Atlanta are going red. And then over time, you see in 1992, the last year that a Democrat won Georgia until this past November, you see that transition over time to where the suburbs and Atlanta are solid blue. Now, many people, I'm from Georgia, and many people who talk about Georgia tend to think in terms of Georgia as being two states, Atlanta and everything else, to the point where I had to tell people when I tried to explain that I'm from Milledgeville. And even then, like, I'm really from Irwington, and I tried to explain that to people outside the state in Wilkinson County. They had no clue. But Milledgeville, neither, to the point where you have to talk, well, it's outside of Atlanta. It's close to Macon. When it comes to our politics, historically, V.O. Key, the scholar that really looked at politics and Southern politics in the 1940s, described Georgia as rule of the rustics because the rural area of the state held so much sway and dominated the state through a mechanism called the county unit vote, where counties were divided and voted on like the Electoral College, where if you won a county, you won the county unit vote, and that really helped ensure with all those counties we saw in Georgia that rural areas had a lot more influence than the urban areas. To the standpoint that Eugene Talmadge, when he ran for governor in the 30s, would always argue that he never wanted to win a vote in a state, in a part of the state where there was a streetcar, so he never wanted to win a vote from a city part of the state, an urban part of the state. To where we have Georgia today, where we're in some ways, when it comes to our politics, still two Georgias, but that suburban part of Atlanta has moved to the Democratic Party, which is having a lot of effect in making elections more competitive. And we've seen even more of that over the last 4 years. Now, 2016, President Trump won Georgia by around 5 percentage points. From 2016 to 2020, these blue arrows you see on the chart are transitions in that area of those counties from voting Republican to Democrat. Doesn't mean that those areas went to the Democratic Party. They just had larger percentages of their votes to the Democratic Party in the last election. And you see a lot of shifts in suburban parts of the state. And again, once again, just to get in and look more at the detail, you see, think back to those charts of the metropolitan area, you see the darker blue areas are not necessarily areas with overall more votes for the Democratic Party. The areas where you had a stronger move to the Democratic Party in 2016 to 2020. And you see that donut kind of within the circle that I've put on the graph around Atlanta, where the suburban voting precincts have moved to the Democratic Party over the last presidential election. And within that, you see the move to have been among high income earners, college graduates, majority age. You had some parts of Georgia looking at that went from Obama to Trump that went back to the Democratic Party in this election, presidential election. So what happened between two, just I kind of want to end off, I really tried to keep this presentation as brief as possible. One, we're still learning what happened. And two, I want to be able to answer any questions you may have if I can answer them. But also I wanted to talk just a little bit about the election we saw this past week. I know it probably seems like 100 years ago with the way things have been going for our nation this week, but we did have a very historic general election, for the president in Georgia. It was historic that Georgia went blue and Joe Biden won, first time since 1992. But we also had a very historic special election for our 2 Senate seats to the U.S. Congress in Georgia. And what happened with that? Well, a few things. You had these trends continue where suburbs were more competitive. You see parts of the Atlanta metro area here that actually moved even further to the Democratic Party between the general election and then the special election for the 2 U.S. Senate seats. You had that reinforcing and continuing to occur. In this special elections are usually very low turnout elections. They usually get about the same amount of turnout as a primary election, so it's really a low turnout affair. But in this special election, you saw about 92% of the Democratic turnout that you saw in the general election, and in the upper 80% or so for the Republican side. So the Democrats, while there was historic turnout for a special election on both sides of the aisle, the Democrats were able to have about 4 to 5% higher points of turnout compared to the general election. Some other things you saw in this is that as a percentage of the electorate, voter turnout among Black Georgians was pretty low in the general election. It increased significantly between the general election and the special election as a percentage of the electorate that voted in that. So whereas we like to talk in terms of political science of primary elections and elections to Congress typically being different groups of voters than the people in the elections that vote for the president, this special election looked very much like, with some changes I was just talking about, the election that we saw for the president. And then the effect that we've had over the last few weeks in President Trump's behavior had, in many ways, and many would argue, and we'll see more as it comes out, a negative effect on this election on Tuesday, because you saw areas of the state that had given Purdue and Loeffler underperformed in a number of Republican areas in the state compared to what in suburban areas compared to what they did in their general election vote totals. So that gives us some ideas that there were some movement of votes from people who voted for Purdue and Loeffler in the general election that moved away from them over the last few weeks. So that is what I have now. And I look forward to your questions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Well, I'll keep sharing in case anybody has any questions about the charts and stuff. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hatcher. Who has their first question?
Oh, that's good. I thought it was going to be a lot of.
Oh, no.
I'm a little worried about doing this presentation today, actually, but
I'm
No.
sure there are questions.
yeah.
I'm sure it was very, very changing as you went through trying to get ready. And you may have mentioned this, what percent of the population of the state is Atlanta relative to the overall state?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head, so that's a little dangerous, but the Atlanta metro area is around 5 million and the overall state is about 12 million now. So
Okay.
it's a good,
That
and
sounds right.
it depends on how you define the Atlanta metro area. The charts here that I was showing, that is the federal government's formal definition, but oftentimes in studies and when people talk about Atlanta, they extend that out significantly more than that. You know, the reach of the Atlanta goes, you know, to the east all the way in many ways to Conyers and Covington, and then to the west, almost to Alabama. So, yeah.
Looking
my-
at those,
My question, this is Jeff. You know, on this particular chart that you're looking at, we see from 84 to 2020 that gradual shift. Would you say that Georgia tends to be, was that a slower shift than other parts of the country, or did we have, or are we tracking with everybody else?
We're different. We're different than other southern states. Other southern states during this period, Georgia was very similar to other southern states during what I was talking about, this transition from being solid Democrat to solid Republican. Many other southern states are solid Republican. And we had that in Georgia starting largely in the 1984 presidential election. It would have happened in 1980, but with Jimmy Carter running, that changed things. But we saw that at presidential level, then at the federal level for Congress and state elected officials. We saw that in the late 90s and early 2000s, that kind of trickle down effect where Georgia moved to be solid Republican. But we've jumped back to being competitive. A lot of the other southern states are pretty solid Republican. So it's different than a lot of our southern states. When we see
Would you
this.
credit that to the demographic population? I think like since like the late 90s to now, Georgia has always been on the top lists of places to live, places to move, cost of living. So we've got this influx of people that have been moving to our state from these Democratic strongholds where our other southern states aren't as appealing economically. So that's probably a huge tie-in there too, I would think.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. And that's what we've seen with that slow transition I was talking about that accelerated to a certain degree over the last few years in Georgia, is that demographic change, migration from other parts of the nation, Georgia becoming more diverse. It fits closer within what you see as the makeup of other Democratic parts of the nation, the parts that vote for the Democratic Party.
One comment I'd add, it'd be interesting to see the population growth relative to the change in the colors on the map, because, you know, the Olympics in the 90s and how much Atlanta's really taken off since 84 even. It's incredible, the growth up there. And that's got just the sheer number of people has changed a lot.
Yeah,
Well,
Gwinnett
it was
and
interesting
Cobb
to
County.
see. Oh, I'm sorry. It was also interesting to see how Columbia County and Richmond County kind of played out as well throughout this recently.
And you can see a lot of this, you know, I focused a good bit on the suburbs of Atlanta. That's where there's a large number of votes either way. But, you know, that's one of the reasons a lot of political scientists don't like to talk in terms of red states and blue states, because when you get down within states, there's certain areas that are really red and there's certain areas that are really blue. And, you know, if you even look at a state like California, there's a lot of red areas in California, and a lot of members of the U.S. House of Representatives are Republicans from California. So you see a lot of other areas of the state that are blue also, but there's just more raw numbers in the Atlanta area than those places. And some of this tracks with history that you look at if you go back further, you still see blue to 2018 gubernatorial, but further back to 2004 presidential election, you see some of the blue areas outside of Atlanta still being the same over that time. But the main change has been those suburbs around Atlanta.
I have a question, Dr. Hatcher.
Yeah, sure.
If we wanted to rig the election, wouldn't we have to employ thousands of people and train them and make sure they kept quiet?
That's one. Our system's often very frustrating because we have such a complex federal system with over 90,000 local government units, cities and counties, 50 states, and then the federal government. And each state runs its own election, and then they devolve that to the local levels oftentimes. It would take a mass conspiracy beyond, in our system, anything possible to do that. We have within, just within Georgia, we have elections are usually, a state affair, but also a county affair. Counties have a lot of influence over how elections are administered. And we have 159 counties in Georgia. So that diffusion of authority in our system often frustrates people when we make public policy, because it's very hard to put public policy and changes in place. But when it comes to things like this, we have a lot of fail-safes in that things are not centralized.
Who else has questions? Well, I have a couple. You mentioned about the fact that the senators that the state of Georgia just elected were more progressive than you would traditionally think, would come out of the state of Georgia. Can you elaborate on why you think that is? And then the second part of the question is, how do you think that is going to impact, what the Senate does in the next 2 years?
Well, by more traditional, I'm thinking along the lines of someone like Sam Nunn, who was a pretty conservative Democrat. Max Cleveland also, who was the last Democrat to represent us in the U.S. Senate, was a fairly moderate Democrat. We're talking in terms of, it's very difficult when you get into this because we're comparing today's views on ideology to past decades ago in many ways, but we'll see more so what ideology means when Warnock is up for election. He finished up Isaacson's term, and that term ends in 2023, so he'll be up for election in 2022. So we'll see then, because what effect kind of isolate beyond the effect that President Trump had on the election. Some of it, like I mentioned, you have a shift somewhat in between the general election and the special election, away from the Republican candidates to the Democratic candidates. So when we take that effect out, you'll see more along the lines of whether or not a pretty liberal candidate like Warnock can win in Georgia. Looking at the demographics and transition over time, they're more competitive. Georgia's just more competitive for Democrats. So, and those are the Democrats that are around today. We don't have Southern moderate Democrats anymore because conservative Republicans replaced them in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So progressives, these two candidates too, are pretty progressive. So that's one of the things that hasn't been discussed as much, that why the election was such a huge historic one in Georgia, is that you have two senators elected to the from Georgia, from the Democratic Party, that are pretty progressive, that are very much more so progressive than past Democrats that were elected from the state.
Okay, who else has questions? If you don't want to talk, you can put it in the chat.
I have a question.
Okay.
Since, being here on the border of Georgia and South Carolina, we have a lot of people who kind of live over in South Carolina and sort of operate here in Georgia. So I know a lot of people are curious kind of about how we all sort of feel like we're one big state here, the CSRA, or at least one, we have different rules on, in our same metropolitan area. So can you talk a little bit about South Carolina versus Georgia and how that works with us politically?
Yeah, definitely. One of my friends texted me on the Senate election day and to make sure I voted. Like, I'm not gonna vote. I tell her, I wish I can, but I live in South Carolina. Because there is, the people think that North Augusta is in Georgia. I don't know how many times I have to explain that. South Carolina is different. A couple things that make South Carolina different. I mean, the Democrats tried very hard to defeat Lindsey Graham, spent historic levels of money, and didn't come that close. So what's going on in South Carolina? And Trump won re-election in South Carolina, a pretty comfortable margin for this election. So what's going on in South Carolina is that, when you get down to it, you don't have these large numbers of suburban voters around Atlanta like you do around Atlanta. You don't have that degree in South Carolina as you do in Georgia. South Carolina's had economic growth, of course, over the last few decades, but not to the same extent where you have in Georgia and changing the demographics in South Carolina. So that keeps South Carolina more in the solid red level. These same transitions and what's changing in demographics and what's changing in the way the suburbs are voting are not occurring in South Carolina. And South Carolina historically has been even more of a solid Republican state than Georgia. Even though South Carolina still had senators from the Democratic Party up, until close to 2000, more so than other southern states, it was still more of a solid red state and larger margins than Georgia many times.
Okay, other questions? No one's gonna ask the 10,000-pound gorilla in the room? Anyone? Okay, Dr. Hatcher, why is it taking so long to get the Democratic senators, and what do you think is going to happen moving forward?
What we're moving forward, oh, that's dangerous. That's been one of the things. That's why I'm glad. That's why I did a little warning at the beginning of this that this is not my main area of expertise. I've been trained in it. I know a little bit. Luckily, it's not what I research. We have a lot of great people that research this and trying to figure out what happened and what's going to happen. The effect of President Trump is like a lot of things really is what clouds based on what we've known in the past. What we've known in the past about how elections matter is that individual candidates matter, but not as much as we've seen in the era of Trump, where you have so much effect in one party by one individual. Like I mentioned earlier to Martha's question, when we see in 2022, when you don't have this effect of what we saw in the special Senate elections, where President Trump was contesting an election, you had a lot of rhetoric and you had a lot of movement because of that. We'll see more of an effect of how this plays out in the future in Georgia. And Warnock's going to have, just from past trends, and a very difficult time facing re-election. But that's still very significant in that you go back in time to 2014 and some of the earlier recent elections for our U.S. senators in Georgia, they haven't been that competitive at all. So it's still going to be competitive after you take that out of effect. But coming up in the next presidential elections, Georgia's going to probably continue this trend to being a very competitive state, which for us is a good in the way we do elections, in that we'll get more attention in Georgia every 4 years than we have in the past. In past, recent presidential elections, we'll get more attention. We'll get the candidates campaigning here more and things like that.
More TV ads.
More TV ads and more radio ads. The radio ads killed me. more TV ads, more radio ads, and people that live in South Carolina get on the border get the effect from those ads. Georgia's a pretty this election U.S. Senate was historic in the amount of money that was spent. So that's why there was just a tsunami of ads. Is just the amount of money that was spent. A lot of that money, especially during the COVID era of campaigning, which a lot of it is not traditional canvassing and door to door. It was, a lot of it TV and radio ads.
I have another question.
Yeah, sure.
This may be out of your area of expertise, but what do you think the chances are of a strong or a possibility of a third party coming along?
It's in our system, it's hard for third parties to be successful. It's one of the things that's in the social sciences, I hate the word soft sciences, but different than the hard science in that we don't have specific laws like the laws of physics and gravity. But we do have certain things that we've seen research over and over again that have supported this. And one of those explanations is difficult in a system like ours where we have winner take all and single member districts for third parties to really be successful. In a system where you don't have winner take all, where like in a legislative body, like in a parliament, where you have proportional representation, where you have, say, 15% of one party got 15% of the vote, they'll get a certain allocation of the seats. Another party that got 30% will get a certain allocation. There's all these structural incentives in that situation for third parties or smaller parties to form. In our system, the structural influence is if you get 51% of a congressional district or 51% of the state, you get that one seat. The other party that got 49% doesn't. So the incentives in our system, it's for smaller parties that may have broken off to go within the major parties and try to change them. Like we saw about 12 years ago with the Tea Party, where the Tea Party and another democracy may have formed their own individual party and ran under that, went within the Republican Party and shifted the thinking within the Republican Party. And also, the winners write the rules in our system. The rules of elections favor a two-party system, the two parties. So it's very difficult for a third party to come in, but we've seen it, with Ross Perot, of course. But even then, even though it got a large percentage of the vote compared to past third-party candidates in the 1992 election, it still, the structure of the system makes it very difficult. Because there's been some talk of a middle party forming maybe out of the Republican Party, but our system has a lot of structural things that would make that very difficult.
Thank you.
And that's one of the things that reformers say that we need to change about our system. But that's a whole nother conversation.
Any other questions for Dr. Hatcher? Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Hatcher, for sharing your insights and expertise. I have a million other questions, but we can talk about those offline. I do want to make sure everyone knows that our next meeting will be January 25th. So we're going back to our regular every other Monday. And of course, next week is Martin Luther King Jr. Weekend, and we wouldn't be having our meeting then. Anyway, our speaker will be Pete Fletcher, who's going to be discussing the SPLOS projects in the area and kind of giving us an update on that topic. I am going to end with a thought for the week. And following along the whole presidential politics line, I found this quote from FDR that I think is really good given everything that's going on in the world right now. Let us never forget that government is ourselves and not an alien power over us. The ultimate rulers for our democracy are not a president and senators and congressmen and government officials, but the voters of this country. So let's remember that. Let's all be safe, stay well, and we'll see you guys back on the 25th. Thanks again, Dr. Hatcher, and thanks to Troy for coordinating. Bye, guys.
Thank you all. Have a good day.